At Dad's anniversary, my sister declared, "Pack your suitcases, loser. We're selling the apartment." Everyone clapped and clinked glasses. I silently stepped out and dialed one number. 5 minutes later, hysteria broke out in the house. You know what they say about family gatherings? They're supposed to bring people together. Well, let me tell you about the family gathering that tore everything apart. My name is Jake, and I'm 34 years old. I've been living in the same apartment building my entire life. First with my parents, then alone after they passed away in a car accident 5 years ago. The apartment wasn't much to look at from the outside. A red brick building from the 1970s with creaky elevators and thin walls where you could hear Mrs. Henderson's television through the floor. But it was home. More than that, it was all I had left of Mom and Dad. Their pictures still hung on the walls. Mom's ceramic owl collection still sat on the kitchen windowsill. And Dad's old leather recliner still held the perfect impression of his body. I worked as a maintenance supervisor at a local community college. Not glamorous, but steady. The pay was enough to cover the mortgage payments, utilities, and groceries, with a little left over for the occasional movie night. I kept to myself mostly. Said hello to neighbors in the hallway, helped old Mr. Patterson carry his groceries up 3 flights when the elevator broke down again. My sister Rebecca lived across town in one of those fancy gated communities with perfectly manicured lawns and houses that all looked like they came from the same catalog. She'd married her college boyfriend David right after graduation, and he'd done well for himself in real estate development. They had twin boys, Mason and Tyler, both 16 now, and more interested in their phones than anything their boring Uncle Jake had to say. Rebecca and I weren't close. We'd grown apart after Mom and Dad died, though I couldn't exactly pinpoint when or why. She'd come by the apartment maybe 3 or 4 times a year, always with this look on her face like she was visiting a museum exhibit titled "How Poor People Live." She'd make polite conversation, ask about work, comment on how I really should think about updating the kitchen, then leave with promises to get together soon that we both knew were empty. The anniversary she was talking about was Dad's birthday. He would have been 68 this year. Every year since he passed, I'd spend the day quietly at home, looking through old photo albums and eating his favorite meal, meatloaf with mashed potatoes and green beans from a can. It wasn't much of a celebration, but it felt right. It felt like honoring his memory in a way that mattered. But this year, Rebecca had other ideas. She called me up on a Tuesday evening while I was fixing a broken sink in the dormitory basement. My hands were covered in rust and pipe grime when my phone started buzzing in my pocket. "Jake, hi, it's me." Her voice came through crystal clear, with that slight uptick at the end that meant she wanted something. "Listen, I've been thinking about Dad's birthday this year, and I really think we should do something special. You know, really celebrate his life." I wiped my hands on an old rag and leaned against the concrete wall. The basement smelled like industrial cleaner and that musty dampness that never really goes away in old buildings. "What did you have in mind?" "Well, David and I were thinking we could host something at our place. You know, invite some of Dad's old friends, maybe some neighbors from the old neighborhood. Make it a real celebration of his life." Something about the way she said "celebration of his life" made my stomach tighten. It sounded rehearsed, like she'd been practicing the phrase in front of a mirror, but I didn't want to be the difficult brother, the one who couldn't go along with family plans. "That sounds nice, Rebecca. What can I bring?" "Oh, don't worry about bringing anything. Just bring yourself. And Jake? Maybe wear something a little nicer than your usual work clothes. David's business partner might be there with his wife." After we hung up, I stood in that basement for another 10 minutes, listening to the hum of the building's heating system and trying to shake the feeling that something was off. But I told myself I was being paranoid. Rebecca was just trying to do something nice for Dad's memory. Maybe it was time we started acting like a real family again. The week leading up to the party, I found myself cleaning the apartment more thoroughly than I had in months. I wasn't sure why. It's not like Rebecca would be coming by beforehand. But somehow, scrubbing the bathroom tiles and organizing the kitchen cabinets made me feel like I was preparing for something important. Like I was getting ready to honor Dad properly. I even went out and bought a new shirt, nothing fancy, just a dark blue button-down from the department store downtown. The saleswoman, probably in her 50s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, helped me pick it out. "This color brings out your eyes," she said, adjusting the collar. "Special occasion?" "My father's birthday," I told her. "Well, he passed away a few years ago, but we're having a celebration of his life." Her expression softened. "I'm sure he'd be proud to see you honoring his memory like this." I hoped she was right. Standing in front of the dressing room mirror, wearing a shirt that cost more than I usually spent on clothes in 2 months, I tried to imagine Dad's reaction. He'd probably tease me about getting all dressed up, then pat my shoulder and tell me I looked good. That was Dad's way. Gentle ribbing followed by genuine affection. The morning of the party, I woke up earlier than usual. Saturday mornings were typically reserved for laundry and grocery shopping, maybe catching up on whatever maintenance projects I'd brought home from work. But today felt different. Important. I made coffee in Dad's old percolator, the kind that sits on the stove and makes that distinctive bubbling sound when it's ready. The kitchen filled with the rich, familiar aroma that always reminded me of weekend mornings when I was a kid. Dad would be at the kitchen table with his crossword puzzle. Mom would be humming something while she cooked pancakes. And the whole apartment would smell like coffee and possibility. While the coffee brewed, I walked through each room slowly, really looking at everything. The family photos covering the living room wall, birthday parties, Christmas mornings, the vacation we took to Yellowstone when I was 12. Mom's needlepoint sampler hanging above the couch. "Home is where the heart is," in faded blue thread. Dad's collection of model trains displayed on shelves he'd built himself, each locomotive positioned precisely where he'd left it. This wasn't just an apartment. It was a repository of memories, a physical manifestation of 34 years of life. Every scuff mark on the hardwood floors told a story. The height marks penciled onto the doorframe of my childhood bedroom chronicled my journey from a scrawny 8-year-old to the man I'd become. Around noon, I started getting ready. I showered, shaved carefully, and put on the new shirt along with my best pair of khakis, the ones I usually saved for job interviews or funerals. Looking at myself in the bathroom mirror, I barely recognized the person staring back. Without the usual work uniform of paint-splattered jeans and company polo shirts, I looked almost respectable. Professional, even. The drive to Rebecca's house took about 25 minutes through suburban streets lined with strip malls and chain restaurants. Her neighborhood was the kind of place where every lawn was perfectly edged and every house had a 2-car garage. The kind of place where people paid services to put up Christmas lights and take them down again. Rebecca's house was a 2-story colonial with white siding and black shutters that had never been used to actually shut anything. A circular driveway curved around a small island, planted with ornamental shrubs that probably had Latin names I couldn't pronounce. David's BMW was parked in the driveway next to Rebecca's SUV, both vehicles so clean they practically sparkled in the afternoon sun. I parked my 10-year-old Honda on the street, suddenly self-conscious about the rust spot near the rear wheel well and the crack in the windshield I'd been meaning to get fixed for 8 months. Walking up their brick pathway, I could hear voices and laughter coming from the backyard. The sound of people having a good time, the kind of effortless social gathering that always made me feel like an outsider looking in. Rebecca answered the door before I could ring the bell. She was wearing a sundress in some sort of floral pattern, her hair pulled back in a style that looked casual, but probably took an hour to achieve. Behind her, I could see the interior of their house. All open floor plans and granite countertops and furniture that looked like it came straight from a magazine. "Jake, you made it, and look at you all dressed up." She gave me a quick hug that smelled like expensive perfume and something floral. "Everyone's out back. David's got the grill going, and the boys are actually being social for once." She led me through their house, pointing out recent renovations and new purchases as we walked. The kitchen island that cost more than I made in 2 months. The living room furniture they'd had custom made by some designer whose name I was supposed to recognize. Everything was perfect, coordinated, and completely without personality. The backyard was even more impressive. A sprawling lawn surrounded by professional landscaping, a deck that could have hosted a small wedding, and outdoor furniture that looked like it belonged in a resort brochure. About 15 people were scattered around, holding drinks and making conversation in that easy way that people do when they're comfortable and confident. I recognized a few faces. Mr. and Mrs. Kowalski from the old neighborhood, Dad's former supervisor from the factory, Rebecca's mother-in-law, who always looked at me like I was tracking mud on her clean floors. But most of the guests were strangers, probably David's business associates and their wives. David spotted me first and walked over with a broad smile and an extended hand. He was one of those guys who looked like he'd stepped out of a commercial for expensive watches. Perfectly styled hair, teeth white enough to blind small aircraft, and a handshake that was just a little too firm. "Jake, great to see you, buddy. Thanks for coming out. Your sister's been looking forward to this all week." He clapped me on the shoulder with the kind of enthusiasm that felt rehearsed. "What can I get you to drink? We've got soda, water, some of that fancy sparkling stuff Rebecca likes." I asked for water and found myself standing at the edge of the deck, watching everyone else mingle effortlessly. This was Rebecca's world. Successful people in expensive clothes talking about vacation destinations I'd never heard of and business deals that involved more money than I'd see in a lifetime. I felt like an actor who'd wandered onto the wrong stage. But then Mrs. Kowalski spotted me and made her way over. She was probably in her 70s now, moving carefully but with determination. She and her husband had lived next door to us for 20 years before moving to a retirement community across town. "Jacob, dear, how are you holding up?" She took my hands in hers, and I could feel the arthritis in her knuckles. "Your father would be so happy to see all these people gathered in his honor." "Thank you for coming, Mrs. K. It means a lot." "Oh, nonsense. Your father was a good man, and good men deserve to be remembered." She lowered her voice slightly. "Between you and me, I think this is exactly the kind of thing he would have enjoyed. He always said the best parties were the ones where people actually talked to each other instead of staring at their phones." We talked for a few more minutes about Dad's legendary barbecue skills and his habit of lending tools to neighbors who never quite got around to returning them. It felt good to remember him with someone who actually knew him, who had shared genuine moments with the man he really was, rather than some idealized version. As the afternoon wore on, I started to relax a little. Maybe Rebecca was right. Maybe this was a good way to honor Dad's memory. People were sharing stories about him, laughing at his old jokes, remembering the time he'd helped jump-start half the cars in the neighborhood during that ice storm in '98. But there was something nagging at me. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Little things. The way Rebecca kept checking her watch. how David seemed to be steering conversations away from certain topics. The fact that several people mentioned how smart Rebecca was for making difficult decisions and thinking about the future. Around 4 o'clock, Rebecca tapped her fork against her glass to get everyone's attention. The conversations gradually died down as people turned toward the deck where she was standing. David moved to stand beside her, and their boys flanked them like some sort of family portrait. "Thank you all for being here today," Rebecca began, her voice carrying that practiced confidence she'd always had. "It means so much to have Dad's friends and family gathered together like this. He always said that the measure of a man's life wasn't in what he accumulated, but in the people who cared enough to remember him." There were murmurs of agreement from the crowd. Someone said, "Here, here," and raised their glass. "Dad taught us a lot of things," Rebecca continued. "But one of the most important lessons was about making smart decisions for the future, about not being sentimental when it comes to practical matters." Something cold settled in my stomach. The way she emphasized practical matters made my hands feel sweaty despite the mild weather. Which is why I'm so glad Jake is here today, because there's something important we need to discuss as a family. Every eye in the backyard turned toward me. I felt like a specimen under a microscope, suddenly aware of every breath, every heartbeat. Rebecca was smiling, but it wasn't reaching her eyes. "Jake, I know this might come as a surprise, but David and I have been doing some research and we found a buyer for the apartment." The words hit me like a physical blow. The conversations around me faded into white noise, and I could hear my own pulse pounding in my ears. "What are you talking about?" "The apartment, Jake. Mom and Dad's place. It's time to sell it. The neighborhood is gentrifying, property values are going up, and frankly, it's not practical for you to keep living there alone. The maintenance costs, the property taxes, it's just not sustainable." I looked around the backyard, at all these strangers nodding their heads like Rebecca was making perfect sense. Like she was being responsible and mature while I was just being difficult. "But Rebecca, I live there. It's my home." "I know it feels like home, but Jake, be realistic. You can't afford to maintain a place like that on your salary. And Mom and Dad wouldn't want us to make emotional decisions about money, would they?" The way she phrased it made it sound like I was being childish, like wanting to keep living in the only home I'd ever known was some sort of character flaw. David nodded supportively beside her, and I noticed several other guests exchanging glances that seemed to say, "Poor Jake, he just doesn't understand how the real world works." "So, here's what we've decided," Rebecca continued, her voice getting stronger and more confident. "We found a developer who's very interested in the building. He's offering well above market value because he wants to renovate the whole place. We can split the money 50-50, and Jake, you can use your half to get a nice little apartment somewhere more suitable. Maybe one of those new complexes closer to your work." The backyard seemed to spin around me like I was on some horrible carnival ride. Rebecca was still talking, explaining logistics and timelines and practical considerations. But her words were coming to me through what felt like thick cotton. Someone refilled my water glass. Mrs. Kowalski patted my arm sympathetically. David's business partner's wife, a woman whose name I hadn't caught, leaned over to whisper something about how hard these transitions can be. "The closing is scheduled for next month," Rebecca was saying. "I've already signed the preliminary paperwork as co-owner. Jake, you'll just need to sign a few documents, and then we can start the moving process. I've got the contact information for some really good moving companies that specialize in downsizing." Downsizing. The word tasted bitter in my mouth, like my entire life was something that needed to be compressed, minimized, made more manageable for everyone else's convenience. Rebecca, I managed to say, my voice sounding strange and far away. We need to talk about this privately. Oh, Jake, there's nothing to be embarrassed about. Everyone here understands that sometimes families have to make difficult financial decisions. Right, everyone. And that's when it happened. The thing that still makes my hands shake when I think about it. Every single person in that backyard, 15 people who barely knew me, who had never set foot in my parents' apartment, who had no connection to my life or my memories, started nodding and murmuring agreement. Someone actually said, "Absolutely." Another person raised their glass and said, "To smart financial planning." Mr. Kowalski, Dad's old supervisor, cleared his throat and said, "Your father was always practical about money, Jake. He'd want you to make the smart choice here." That's when I realized this wasn't a spontaneous announcement. This was a performance. Rebecca had orchestrated this entire gathering, invited all these people, and turned my father's birthday celebration into some sort of intervention designed to pressure me into giving up my home. I stood up so fast that my plastic chair scraped against the deck boards with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. "I need some air." "Jake, wait," Rebecca called after me, but I was already walking across their perfect lawn toward the gate that led to their front yard. Behind me, I could hear David's voice saying something about emotional reactions and needing time to process. I made it to my car before the shaking started. Sitting in the driver's seat with my hands gripping the steering wheel, I tried to process what had just happened. My sister, my only remaining family, had decided to sell our childhood home without consulting me. She'd invited a bunch of strangers to witness what she apparently thought would be my grateful acceptance of her practical decision. She'd turned our father's birthday into a real estate transaction. My phone started buzzing with text messages. Rebecca, of course. "Jake, please don't be upset. This is really for the best." I know it's a shock, but once you think about it rationally, you'll see this makes sense. David's friend knows about a great apartment complex near your work. Much more affordable. I turned off my phone and drove home in complete silence. Walking back into the apartment felt like entering a time machine. Everything was exactly as I'd left it that morning. Dad's coffee mug still sitting next to the sink where I'd placed it after washing it. Mom's ceramic owls catching the late afternoon sunlight, the family photos covering every available surface. But now, instead of comfort, these familiar surroundings felt fragile, temporary, like I was visiting a museum that was scheduled to be demolished. I sat down in Dad's old recliner and tried to think. Rebecca was co-owner of the apartment, that much was true. When Mom and Dad died, they'd left everything to both of us equally. But I'd been the one living here, paying the mortgage, handling the maintenance, treating it like the home it had always been. Rebecca had her own house, her own life. Why did she need this too? The answer, when it came to me, was so obvious I felt stupid for not seeing it earlier. Money. It wasn't about practicality or my best interests or what Mom and Dad would have wanted. It was about Rebecca wanting her share of what she saw as a valuable asset. The neighborhood really was gentrifying. I'd seen the construction crews working on renovations, the new coffee shops opening where old diners used to be, the young professionals in expensive clothes walking dogs that probably cost more than my monthly salary. But this wasn't just real estate to me. This was the kitchen where Mom taught me to make her famous chocolate chip cookies, always insisting that the secret ingredient was a little extra love. This was the living room where Dad and I would watch Sunday football games, him explaining plays and statistics with the patience of someone who genuinely enjoyed teaching. This was the bedroom where I'd spent countless nights as a kid. listening to my parents' voices drifting through the thin walls, feeling safe and protected in the knowledge that they were there. How do you put a price on memories? How do you pack up 34 years of life and move it to some generic apartment complex where the walls are beige and the appliances are energy efficient, but nothing belongs to you? I must have sat in that chair for 2 hours, watching the sunlight move across the wall where my school photos were displayed in chronological order. Kindergarten through high school graduation, documenting the transformation from a gap-toothed kid with cowlicks to a reasonably presentable young man in a cap and gown. Mom had insisted on getting wallet-sized copies of every single picture, and she'd carried them in her purse until the day she died. Around 7 o'clock, someone knocked on my door. Heavy, authoritative knocks that definitely weren't Rebecca's style. I looked through the peephole and saw David standing in the hallway, still wearing his barbecue host outfit, but looking significantly less comfortable than he had a few hours earlier. "Jake? I know you're in there, buddy. Can we talk for a minute?" I considered pretending I wasn't home, but David was the kind of guy who would probably stand out there knocking until Mrs. Henderson called the building manager. I opened the door but didn't invite him in. "Hey," he said, flashing that practice smile. "Mind if I come in? Rebecca's pretty upset about how things went today." "Rebecca's upset?" The laugh that came out of my mouth sounded harsh, even to me. That's interesting. David stepped into the apartment without waiting for an invitation, and I watched his eyes sweep over the interior with barely concealed assessment. He was probably calculating square footage and potential renovation costs, mentally redesigning the space to appeal to young professionals with more money than sense. "Look, Jake, I get it. This place has sentimental value, but you have to understand, Rebecca's just trying to look out for your best interests." "By selling my home without asking me?" "By helping you make a financially responsible decision." "Jake, buddy, let's be realistic here. What's your monthly income after taxes? 3,000? 3,500? And what are you spending on mortgage payments, utilities, building fees, maintenance? You're probably breaking even every month, maybe going a little into debt. That's no way to live." He walked over to the window and looked out at the courtyard below, where Mr. Patterson was walking his ancient beagle around the same path he'd been walking for 15 years. "With your half of the sale money, you could put a down payment on a nice condo. Something modern, efficient, in a better neighborhood. Build some real equity instead of just treading water in this old place." "This old place is my home." David turned back to me with an expression that managed to be condescending and sympathetic at the same time. "I know it feels like home, but, Jake, home is just a concept. It's not tied to a specific building or location. Home is where you make it." Easy to say when you've never had to leave the place where you grew up. Actually, I have. My parents sold the house I grew up in when I was in college, used the money to buy a condo in Florida. Best decision they ever made. I visited them there for holidays. And you know what? It felt more like home than the old place ever did. Because it was about being with family, not about clinging to some building. There was something about the way he said clinging that made my jaw clench. Like my attachment to this apartment was some sort of weakness, some failure to evolve into a proper adult who understood that everything was ultimately about money and efficiency. "David, I appreciate you coming over here, but this is between Rebecca and me." "See, that's where you're wrong, buddy. Rebecca is my wife. What affects her affects me. And right now, she's beating herself up because she thinks she handled this badly. She's worried that you think she doesn't care about your feelings. Maybe because she doesn't." David's expression hardened slightly, and for a moment I saw past the practiced charm to something colder underneath. That's not fair, Jake. Rebecca loves you. She's just trying to help you see the bigger picture here. You're 34 years old, living alone in a place that's way too big for one person. Spending money you don't have to maintain, something you can't afford to keep. From the outside, it looks like you're stuck. Stuck? In the past, Jake. Holding on to things that are keeping you from moving forward with your life. When's the last time you went on a date? When's the last time you took a vacation or bought something for yourself that wasn't absolutely necessary? You're living like you're afraid to change anything, like you're waiting for your parents to come back. The words hit me like a slap, partly because they were cruel, but mostly because there was just enough truth in them to sting. When was the last time I'd done something purely for enjoyment? When was the last time I'd made a decision based on what I wanted rather than what was practical or necessary? Maybe I like my life the way it is. Or maybe you're scared to find out what your life could be if you let yourself try something different. David walked toward the door, then turned back with what I'm sure he thought was a compassionate expression. Jake, the offer we found is really good. Above market value, and the buyer is willing to work with our timeline. This kind of opportunity doesn't come along often. If you walk away from this, you might regret it for the rest of your life. After he left, I stood in my living room feeling like I'd been hollowed out with a spoon. Was he right? Was I stuck? Was my attachment to this apartment really just fear dressed up as sentiment? I walked through each room slowly, trying to see it through David's eyes. The kitchen with its outdated appliances and cabinet doors that didn't quite close properly. The bathroom where the tile grout had turned gray despite my best efforts to keep it clean. The bedroom where the hardwood floors creaked when you walked from the door to the window. But then I remembered Saturday mornings when the smell of bacon would wake me up and I'd find Dad already in the kitchen making breakfast for the three of us. I remembered winter evenings when Mom would make hot chocolate and we'd play board games at the dining room table while snow fell outside the windows. I remembered the Christmas when I was 8 and convinced myself that I could stay awake to catch Santa. So I snuck out to the living room at midnight and found Dad assembling my new bicycle, cursing quietly when he couldn't figure out how the training wheels attached. These weren't just memories. They were the foundation of who I was. They were proof that I'd been loved, that I'd belonged somewhere, that my life had mattered to the two people who mattered most to me. But David's words kept echoing in my mind. Was I afraid to change? Was I using this apartment as an excuse to avoid building a real adult life? I was still wrestling with these questions when my phone rang again. This time it was Rebecca, and her voice sounded different. Softer, more like the sister I remembered from when we were kids. Jake, I'm sorry about this afternoon. I should have talked to you privately first. Yeah, you should have. I know you're upset, and you have every right to be. But Jake, I need you to understand something. I'm not trying to hurt you. I'm trying to help you. Help me what? Become homeless? Help you start over. Help you build something new instead of just maintaining something old. Jake, do you remember what you wanted to be when you were a kid? The question caught me off guard. What does that have to do with anything? Just answer me. What did you want to be? I closed my eyes and let myself remember being 7 years old, lying on my bedroom floor with a pile of library books about space exploration spread around me. An astronaut. That's right. And then, when you were in high school, you wanted to be an engineer. You were good at math, good at figuring out how things worked. You had plans, Jake. Dreams. So, what happened to those dreams? When did you decide that being a maintenance supervisor was enough? When did you stop wanting more for yourself? I wanted to hang up on her, but something in her voice kept me listening. She sounded genuinely concerned, genuinely confused about how her little brother had ended up settling for so little. Life happened, Rebecca. Mom and Dad died, and someone had to take care of things here. But they've been gone for 5 years, Jake. 5 years. And in all that time, you haven't done anything to move forward. You just kept everything exactly the same, like you were waiting for them to come back. There it was again. The same observation David had made. But coming from Rebecca, it felt less like an attack and more like a worried question. Maybe I like things the way they are. Or maybe you're scared that if you change anything, you'll lose the last connection you have to them. We sat in silence for a long moment, both of us breathing into our phones like awkward teenagers who didn't know how to end a conversation. Rebecca, I can't just walk away from this place. I'm not asking you to walk away from anything important. I'm asking you to walk towards something better. And what if I don't want something better? What if I want this? Then we'll figure something else out, she said. And for the first time all day, she sounded like she meant it. But Jake, will you at least think about it? Will you at least consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, holding on to this apartment isn't helping you honor Mom and Dad's memory? It's keeping you from living the kind of life they would have wanted for you. After Rebecca hung up, I found myself standing in the middle of the living room, looking at everything and nothing at the same time. Her words kept circling in my mind, like water going down a drain. Was I really honoring my parents' memory by keeping everything exactly the same? Or was I just afraid to admit that I didn't know how to build a life without them? I walked over to the bookshelf where Dad kept his collection of science fiction novels. Dozens of paperbacks with covers featuring spaceships and distant planets, their spines creased from multiple readings. He'd loved stories about exploration, about people leaving everything behind to discover new worlds. The future belongs to the brave, Jake, he used to say when I was a kid, afraid to try out for the baseball team or nervous about starting middle school. But somewhere along the way, I'd stopped being brave. I'd stopped reaching for things that seemed impossible and settled for things that felt safe. I pulled out one of his books, a worn copy of something called The Forever War, and found a piece of paper tucked inside the front cover. It was a letter, written in Dad's careful handwriting, addressed to me. Jake, if you're reading this, it probably means your mom and I are gone, and you're trying to figure out what to do next. First, I want you to know how proud we are of the man you've become. You're kind, dependable, and you care about doing the right thing, even when it's not easy. But son, I hope you won't let missing us keep you from living your own life. This apartment was never the most important thing we left you. The most important thing we left you was the knowledge that you're capable of anything you set your mind to. Don't let our memory become a chain that keeps you from flying. Love always, Dad P.S. Your mother made me promise to tell you that she hid some money in her old cookie jar. She wanted you to have something to chase a dream with when you were ready. My hands were shaking by the time I finished reading. I must have walked past that bookshelf thousands of times in the past 5 years, never knowing this letter was waiting for me. It felt like getting a message from beyond the grave, like Dad had somehow known I would need these exact words at this exact moment. I went into the kitchen and found Mom's ceramic cookie jar on the counter next to the microwave. The one shaped like a fat chef with a mustache. The one I'd assumed was just decoration since Mom died. Inside, underneath a layer of dust, were 37 $100 bills and another note in Mom's handwriting. For when you're ready to be brave again. $3,700. Not enough to change my life, but enough to start something new. Enough to take a risk. I sat at the kitchen table where we'd eaten thousands of meals together, holding these messages from my parents and trying to figure out what they meant. Had they known I would get stuck? Had they anticipated that I might need permission to move forward? My phone buzzed with another text from Rebecca. Jake, I've been thinking. What if we postpone the sale for 6 months? Give you time to figure out what you really want. 6 months. Half a year to decide whether I was going to keep hiding in this apartment or start building something that looked more like a real life. I was still sitting at that table, staring at Dad's letter, when someone knocked on my door again. This time it was Mrs. Henderson from downstairs, holding a covered dish that smelled like her famous tuna casserole. I thought you might be hungry, dear. You looked a little upset when you came home earlier. Mrs. Henderson was probably 75 years old. With silver hair she kept in a neat bun and the kind of gentle manner that made everyone in the building feel like her grandchild. She'd brought me casseroles and homemade soup on a regular basis since my parents died, never making a big deal about it, just quietly making sure I was eating properly. Thank you, Mrs. H. You didn't have to do that. Nonsense. We take care of each other here. That's what neighbors do. She paused in my doorway, looking around the apartment with the same fond expression she always got when she visited. Your parents would be so happy to know you've kept everything so nice. Mrs. Henderson, can I ask you something? Of course, dear. Do you think they'd want me to stay here forever? In this apartment, I mean. She studied my face with the sharp intelligence that people often missed beneath her grandmotherly exterior. Jake, honey, what's this really about? So I told her everything. Rebecca's announcement, the pressure to sell, David's visit, the letter I'd just found. Mrs. Henderson listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or making small encouraging sounds. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at the courtyard where Mr. Patterson was walking his dog again. You know, dear, I moved into this building 52 years ago, right after my Harold and I got married. This was supposed to be temporary, just until we saved up enough money for a house with a yard and a white picket fence. What happened? Life happened. Harold got promoted, but the job required travel. I started teaching at the elementary school down the street and fell in love with those children. We kept saying we'd move next year, or maybe the year after that. Before we knew it, 50 years had gone by. She smiled at the memory. After Harold passed, my daughter kept trying to convince me to move somewhere smaller, somewhere with less maintenance. She couldn't understand why I wanted to stay in a place that reminded me of him every day. Why did you stay? At first, I thought it was because I couldn't bear to leave the place where we'd been happy together. But eventually, I realized it wasn't about the apartment at all. It was about being afraid that if I changed anything, I might forget how to be happy. Mrs. Henderson reached over and patted my hand with her soft, wrinkled fingers. Jake, your parents loved you enough to let you go. The question is, do you love them enough to let yourself live? After she left, I sat with her words and my parents' letters until well past midnight. I thought about the dreams I'd given up, the risks I'd stopped taking, the way I'd gradually made my world smaller and smaller until it fit entirely within these 4 walls. And then I thought about something else. A conversation I'd had with Dad the summer before he died. We'd been fixing a leaky faucet in the bathroom, and he'd started talking about retirement plans and what he wanted to do with the rest of his life. You know what I regret most, Jake? He'd said, struggling with a wrench that was probably older than I was. All the things I didn't try because I was too worried about failing. All the chances I didn't take because I was too comfortable with the way things were. Like what? Well, your mother and I always talked about traveling, seeing Europe, maybe taking one of those cruises to Alaska. But there was always something, the mortgage, your education, some emergency that needed our savings account. Now we're in our 60s, and I'm not sure we'll ever make it to those places. He'd finally gotten the faucet to stop dripping, and we'd both stood there for a moment, listening to the silence, where the constant plinking sound had been. Don't make my mistakes, son. Don't let being comfortable keep you from being happy. The next morning, I called in sick to work and spent the day walking around the neighborhood, really looking at it for the first time in years. Rebecca was right about the gentrification. There were construction crews everywhere, young couples pushing expensive strollers, restaurants with names like Artisanal Kitchen and Farm-to-Table Bistro. But there was something else I noticed too. For sale signs. Lots of them. And not just on apartment buildings like mine, on the little houses where families like the Kowalskis had lived for decades, on the corner grocery store where I'd bought candy as a kid, on the auto repair shop where Dad had taken our car for 20 years. The neighborhood wasn't just changing, it was disappearing. The places and people that had made it feel like home were being systematically replaced by newer, shinier versions that had no connection to the community that had existed before. Maybe Rebecca was right about the practical aspects. Maybe this was a good time to sell. Maybe I could get more money now than I would in a few years. But maybe David was wrong about everything else. Maybe holding on to this apartment wasn't about being afraid to change. Maybe it was about refusing to let go of something valuable just because other people didn't understand its worth. I was still wrestling with these thoughts when I got home and found Rebecca sitting on the front steps of my building. She looked smaller than usual, less polished, like she'd been sitting there for a while without caring how her expensive clothes were handling the concrete. "I've been waiting for you," she said. "I wanted to talk." "Rebecca, if this is about the apartment, it's not. Well, it is, but not the way you think." She stood up and brushed dust off her jeans. "Jake, can I come up? There's something I need to tell you." Back in the apartment, Rebecca walked around slowly, touching things she hadn't paid attention to in years. Mom's ceramic owls, Dad's model trains, the family photos covering every available surface. "I haven't really looked at this place in a long time," she said. "I've been so focused on what it represented financially that I forgot what it meant emotionally." She picked up a framed photo from the mantel. The four of us at Christmas morning when I was probably 10 years old. We're all in our pajamas, surrounded by wrapping paper, Mom and Dad looking exhausted but happy, while Rebecca and I show off our new toys. "Do you remember this Christmas?" "Yeah. You got that karaoke machine you'd been asking for all year. Mom and Dad had to listen to you sing the same 3 songs over and over for about 6 months." Rebecca laughed, but it sounded sad. "I was so sure I was going to be a famous singer. I made you be my backup dancer for every performance. I was terrible at it. You were 8 years old and completely tone deaf, but you did it anyway because I asked you to." She set the photo down carefully. "Jake, when did we stop being a team?" The question caught me off guard. "I don't know. After college, maybe? After you got married?" "I think it was after Mom and Dad died. I think I was so scared of dealing with the grief that I just compartmentalized everything, made it about practical matters instead of emotional ones." Rebecca sat down on the couch, in the same spot where she used to curl up to watch Saturday morning cartoons. "David's been pushing me to sell this place for 2 years. He keeps talking about investment opportunities and market values. But that's not really why I wanted to do it." "Then why?" Because every time I come here, I remember what our family used to be like. Before I got so focused on success and status and having the right kind of life. When I walk into this apartment, I remember being the kind of person who would dance backup for her little brother's imaginary concerts. She looked around the room with an expression I hadn't seen from her in years. Vulnerable, uncertain, almost childlike. I thought, if we sold this place, I could stop feeling guilty about the person I've become. Stop being reminded of who I used to be. Rebecca, no, let me finish. I was wrong to ambush you yesterday. I was wrong to make this decision without talking to you first. And I was especially wrong to involve all those people, to try to pressure you into agreeing with me. She reached into her purse and pulled out a folder of papers. I called the buyer this morning and told him we needed more time to think about it. I also told David that this decision is between you and me, and he needs to stay out of it. What did he say about that? He wasn't happy. But Jake, this isn't his family. These aren't his memories. This isn't his decision to make. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both of us looking around the apartment that had shaped our childhoods in different ways. Rebecca, I found something yesterday. I showed her Dad's letter and Mom's note about the cookie jar money. I think they knew we might need permission to move on. Rebecca read both notes twice, tears forming in the corners of her eyes. They always were smarter than us, weren't they? Yeah, they were. She folded the letters carefully and handed them back to me. Jake, what do you want to do? Really want to do? Not what you think you should want or what anyone else thinks is practical. And for the first time since this whole mess started, I had an answer that felt true. I want to keep the apartment. Not because I'm afraid to change, but because some things are worth preserving. This place is worth preserving. Even if it means giving up the money from the sale? Even then. Rebecca nodded slowly. Then that's what we'll do. But Jake, I have one condition. What's that? Use Mom's money to do something that would make them proud. Take a class, go on a trip, chase one of those dreams you gave up. Don't let keeping this apartment become an excuse to stop growing. I thought about Dad's letter, about his regrets, and his advice about being brave. Actually, I've been thinking about going back to school. Maybe studying engineering like I planned to do before. Everything happened. That sounds perfect. Rebecca stood up to leave, then turned back with a smile that reminded me of the sister I'd grown up with. Jake? Next year for Dad's birthday, what do you say we just have dinner here, just the two of us? Order pizza and look through old photo albums. I'd like that. After she left, I sat in Dad's chair and looked around the apartment with fresh eyes. It wasn't a museum or a shrine or a prison. It was home. It was the place where I'd learned what love looked like, what family meant, what it felt like to be safe and valued and understood. But it was also the launching pad for whatever came next. 3 weeks after Rebecca's visit, I was sitting at the kitchen table with college brochures spread out in front of me when someone knocked on my door. It was Mrs. Henderson again. But this time she looked agitated in a way I'd never seen before. Jake, dear, I'm sorry to bother you, but there's something you need to know about your building. What do you mean? I just got a notice from the management company. They're planning to sell the entire building to a developer. All of us, every tenant, we're being evicted. The words hit me like ice water. That's impossible. Most of the apartments are owner-occupied, not rentals. That's what I thought too. But apparently there's some clause in the building's charter about majority ownership. If enough individual units get sold to the same buyer, they can force out the remaining tenants and owners. She handed me a legal notice that was dense with tiny print and incomprehensible language. But the essential message was clear. Everyone in the building had 90 days to vacate the premises. Mrs. Henderson, how is this possible? Don't we have rights? We do, dear, but enforcing them costs money. Lawyer money. The kind of money most of us don't have. I walked her back to her apartment, my mind racing. This couldn't be happening. After everything Rebecca and I had been through, after deciding to keep the apartment, after making plans to honor our parents' memory while still moving forward, it was all being taken away anyway. Back in my apartment, I called Rebecca immediately. Jake, what's wrong? You sound terrible. I explained about the eviction notice, the developer, the 90-day deadline. Rebecca was quiet for so long, I thought we'd been disconnected. Rebecca, are you there? I'm here. Jake, I think I know what's happening. David's been working on a project in your neighborhood, a luxury apartment complex. He's been trying to acquire properties for months. You think David is behind this? I don't know. But Jake, I'm coming over. We need to figure this out. She arrived an hour later with a briefcase full of documents and a grim expression on her face. We spread everything out on the dining room table, the eviction notice, property records she'd printed from the county website, and several contracts with David's company letterhead. Jake, I'm so sorry. You were right to be suspicious. According to the documents, David's development company had been systematically purchasing units in my building for the past 18 months. They already owned 6 of the 12 apartments. Plus, they had contracts to purchase 3 more from elderly residents who'd been pressured into selling. He needs 9 units to trigger the majority ownership clause, Rebecca explained. He's got 6 confirmed, 3 more under contract. That leaves 3 units he still needs, yours, Mrs. Henderson's, and Mr. Patterson's. And he thought he could get mine through you. That's why he was so insistent about the family gathering, about making it seem like a unanimous decision. Jake, if you'd agreed to sell that day, he would have had everything he needed. I stared at the contracts, trying to process the scope of David's deception. He's been planning this for over a year. The whole time he was pretending to be concerned about my financial situation, he was scheming to kick me out of my home anyway. It gets worse, Rebecca said quietly. Look at this. She showed me a marketing brochure for the luxury complex David was planning to build. Riverside Luxury Living, premium apartments for the discerning professional. The rendering showed a gleaming glass and steel building that bore no resemblance to the neighborhood's character or history. The projected rent for a 1-bedroom apartment is $4,000 a month, Rebecca said. Jake, he's not just destroying your building, he's destroying the entire community. I thought about Mrs. Henderson, who'd lived in the building for 52 years. About Mr. Patterson and his ancient beagle walking the same courtyard path every day. About all the families who'd made this place their home, who were now being forced out so David could build overpriced apartments for people who would never care about the neighborhood's history or character. Rebecca, is there anything we can do legally? Maybe, but it would take months, maybe years, and cost more money than any of us have. David knows that. He's counting on people just giving up and walking away. We sat in silence for a few minutes, both of us staring at the documents that laid out the systematic destruction of everything I'd been fighting to preserve. Jake, Rebecca said finally, there's something else. Something I haven't told you about David. What? This isn't the first time he's done something like this. Before we got married, He was involved in a project that displaced dozens of families from affordable housing. When I found out about it, he told me it was just business, that progress sometimes requires difficult decisions. And you were okay with that? I told myself I was. I told myself that David was ambitious and successful, and that was what mattered. But Jake, I've been lying to myself for years about who my husband really is. Rebecca's voice was getting quieter, like she was admitting something she'd never said out loud before. He doesn't care about people, Jake. He doesn't care about families or communities or anything that can't be measured in dollars and square footage. And I've been pretending that was okay because I liked the lifestyle he could provide. Rebecca, no, I need to say this. When I suggested selling the apartment, I wasn't just thinking about market values or your financial situation. Part of me was thinking that if we sold it, I wouldn't have to keep being reminded of what genuine love and loyalty look like. I wouldn't have to compare the family I married into with the family I grew up in. She was crying now, not the careful tears of someone trying to maintain composure, but the messy, honest crying of someone whose world was falling apart. I've spent so much energy trying to become the kind of person who belonged in David's world that I forgot who I actually was. And now I find out that the man I married has been systematically destroying the place where I learned what family meant. I handed her a tissue and tried to think of something comforting to say. But the truth was, I was dealing with my own crisis of faith. For weeks, I'd been telling myself that keeping the apartment was about honoring my parents' memory and preserving something valuable. But what was the point of preserving something if it was just going to be destroyed anyway? Rebecca, what are we going to do? I don't know. But Jake, whatever we do, we're going to do it together. No more secrets, no more hidden agendas. We're going to figure this out as a family. The next morning, I called in sick to work again and spent the day talking to my neighbors. Mrs. Henderson had already started packing, convinced that fighting the eviction was hopeless. Mr. Patterson was exploring assisted living facilities, figuring this was as good a time as any to make that transition. The young couple in apartment 3B had already found a new place and were planning to move out early. But Mrs. Chen from the second floor had a different perspective. She'd been a paralegal before retiring, and she'd spent the previous evening researching the building's legal status. There might be something we can do, she told me over coffee in her apartment, which was filled with the kind of comfortable clutter that accumulates over decades of living in one place. The developer's plan depends on that majority ownership clause, but there's another clause that might work in our favor. She showed me a section of the building's original charter that I'd never seen before. If the remaining owners can prove that the sale would constitute community disruption under the city's Affordable Housing Preservation Ordinance, we can force a review process that could delay the sale for up to 2 years. Is that enough time to fight this? It might be. But Jake, it's not going to be easy. We'd need to document the community impact, get media attention, maybe organize some kind of public pressure campaign. And we'd need everyone to stick together, which means convincing people who are already scared and tired that it's worth fighting. What do you think our chances are? Mrs. Chen smiled, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a flicker of hope. Honestly, I don't know. But I've lived in this building for 23 years. This is my home too, and I'm not giving it up without a fight. That afternoon, I called Rebecca and told her about Mrs. Chen's research. Rebecca was quiet for a long time after I finished explaining the legal options. Jake, if we do this, if we really fight David's plan, it's going to get ugly. He's not going to just back down quietly. I know. And it means I'm going to have to choose between my marriage and my family. Rebecca, I can't ask you to do that. You're not asking. I'm choosing. Jake, I should have made this choice years ago. 2 days later, Rebecca showed up at my apartment with 3 suitcases and a story that explained everything about the phone call I'd made at her anniversary party. She'd confronted David about the building purchase, and their argument had escalated into the kind of fight that ends marriages. He actually admitted it, she told me, sitting at the kitchen table where we'd done homework together as kids. He said he'd been planning this acquisition for 2 years, and that convincing you to sell voluntarily would have made everything easier. When I asked him how he could do that to my family, he said that sometimes personal relationships have to be sacrificed for business opportunities. What did you tell him? I told him that anyone who would sacrifice family for business didn't understand what either word meant. And then I told him I was leaving. Rebecca, are you sure about this? Jake, do you remember what Dad used to say about doing the right thing? I smiled, remembering Dad's favorite lecture about moral courage. He said the right thing is usually the hard thing, but it's still the right thing. This is the hard thing, but it's also the right thing. Over the next several weeks, Rebecca and I worked with Mrs. Chen to organize the remaining residents. We documented the building's history, collected stories from long-term tenants, and researched the impact that David's development would have on the neighborhood's affordable housing stock. We also did something else, something that turned out to be the key to everything that followed. We started talking to people in the surrounding blocks, documenting how many families had been displaced by similar developments over the past few years. What we found was staggering. In the past 3 years, David's company had been involved in projects that had displaced over 200 families from the neighborhood. Elderly residents, young families, immigrants who'd built small businesses, all systematically pushed out to make room for luxury developments that most of them could never afford. Mrs. Henderson, despite her initial pessimism, became our most effective advocate. She'd lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone, and she had stories about every family that had been forced to leave. The Garcias ran that corner grocery for 30 years, she told the City Planning Commission during our first public hearing. They knew everyone's names, gave credit to families who were struggling, made that store feel like the heart of the community. Now it's a boutique coffee shop where a cup of coffee costs more than the Garcias used to charge for a whole meal. The media attention started small. A brief article in the local newspaper about residents fighting gentrification. But the story grew as reporters began investigating David's other projects and discovering the pattern of displacement. The breakthrough came when a television reporter tracked down some of the families who'd been forced out of previous developments. Their stories were heartbreaking. Elderly people separated from communities where they'd lived for decades, young families forced to move farther and farther from the city center as affordable housing disappeared. But the story that really changed everything was Mrs. Patterson's interview. She was 93 years old, had lived in the neighborhood for 7 decades, and had been Mr. Patterson's wife before becoming his widow. She'd been quietly fighting her own eviction while caring for her husband, who had Alzheimer's and became confused and agitated whenever their routine was disrupted. "They want to tear down the place where I raised my children, where my husband and I grew old together," she told the reporter, her voice shaking with emotion. "They say it's progress, but progress for who? Not for the people who made this neighborhood a community. We're just obstacles to be removed so they can build something profitable." The interview aired on the evening news, and by the next morning, our story had gone viral. Suddenly, we weren't just fighting for our individual apartments. We were fighting for the soul of the neighborhood, for the right of long-term residents to stay in the communities they'd helped build. The city council announced they would review David's development proposal, and several council members publicly questioned whether the project served the community's interests. Local activists organized protests outside David's office building. A neighborhood preservation society offered to help us with legal fees. But David wasn't giving up without a fight. He hired a public relations firm to counter our media campaign, painting the residents as obstacles to economic development. He filed legal challenges to delay the city's review process. He even tried to pressure some of the more vulnerable residents by offering them cash bonuses if they agreed to move out immediately. That's when Rebecca made the phone call that changed everything. She'd been staying with me in the apartment, sleeping on the couch and helping coordinate our resistance efforts. But she still had access to David's business accounts, his email, his confidential files. And what she found in those files was explosive. "Jake, you need to see this," she said one evening, her laptop open on the dining room table. "David's been falsifying some of the property assessments to qualify for tax incentives. And look at this. He's been bribing city inspectors to overlook building code violations on his previous projects." The documents Rebecca had found proved that David's business practices went far beyond aggressive development tactics. He'd been systematically defrauding the city, endangering residents of his buildings, and using political connections to circumvent regulations designed to protect communities like ours. "Rebecca, this could put him in prison." "I know. That's why I'm calling the FBI field office tomorrow morning." "Are you sure you want to do this? Once you make that call, there's no going back." Rebecca looked around the apartment, at the family photos, at Mom's ceramic owls, at all the evidence of the love and loyalty that had shaped our childhood. "Jake, do you remember what Mom used to tell us about standing up to bullies? She said bullies only have power if good people are too scared to stop them. David is a bully. He's been using money and power and legal intimidation to destroy communities and hurt families. Someone has to stop him." The next morning, Rebecca called the FBI. 3 hours later, federal agents were at David's office with search warrants. By evening, the story was the lead item on every local news broadcast. "Local developer arrested on federal fraud charges." The charges against David were serious enough that his development company immediately suspended all current projects, including the plan to demolish our building. The other property owners who'd been pressured into selling were given the opportunity to withdraw from their contracts without penalty. But the real victory came a week later, when the city council passed an emergency ordinance protecting long-term residents from mass evictions related to speculative development. The ordinance wasn't perfect, but it was a start. A recognition that communities have value beyond their potential for profit. Mrs. Henderson threw a party in the building's courtyard to celebrate. Nothing fancy, just folding chairs and homemade cookies, and the kind of conversation that happens when people who've been through something difficult together can finally relax. "You know," Mrs. Chen said, watching her grandchildren play in the same courtyard where she'd watched her own children grow up. "6 months ago, I was thinking about moving somewhere smaller, somewhere easier to maintain. But now I can't imagine living anywhere else." Mr. Patterson, who'd been mostly quiet during the crisis, surprised everyone by making a toast. "To Jake and Rebecca," he said, raising a plastic cup of lemonade, "for reminding us that some things are worth fighting for." Rebecca had been staying with me throughout the legal proceedings, and as the crisis wound down, I assumed she'd start looking for her own place. But one evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, she brought up a different possibility. "Jake, I've been thinking, what would you say if I asked to stay here permanently? Not as a temporary arrangement, but as family." "You mean move back home?" "I mean come home. Really come home for the first time in years." I looked around the apartment that had been my refuge and my prison, my connection to the past and my fear of the future. But now it felt like something else entirely. A foundation strong enough to support whatever we decided to build on it. I'd say this place has always been big enough for both of us.